Hey, so this is Bill. My color is not perfect today. I guess I should adjust that. So I'm going to take a quick break and adjust that before we go on. And I'll give a couple minute opening of some of my thoughts about how you make money online, or where you start at least. For you following along on Evergreen, I just adjusted my profile. I use a little tool. I'm using a Mac, and I use a little tool called Webcam. I think it's called Webcam Basics or Webcam, or let me double check. I never remember. It's such a simple name. It's called Webcam Settings. It's a download. It's about $10 on iTunes. So I just adjusted my light. I don't have my black screen up today. And I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about where you start in a business online. So where did I start? We had a real estate company in California, and we're going to start one in Nevada. And my wife didn't want to put the money into the office. So I went in and said, well, what can I do online to take a break? And while she reestablishes here with another brokerage, she actually started a brokerage. So where do you start? You have to learn WordPress, I think, or understand it, or contract it out. It can be very expensive. You have to have some way to know, like, and trust. And I think Blab is probably one of the easiest possible ways I've seen to start creating content. I started doing podcasts, Podcaster's Home, and you'll see a lot of my podcasts there. And they're a lot of work. By the time you edit and do all the things that have to be done and post them, they're a lot of work. Where if you can take a Blab, it's going to put it up on iTunes with 480p. It's 480 about a square. It's not real high res. 720 is a lot of your training. So anyway, good place to start is, I think, just start doing Blabs. Do some kind of weekly Blab or start doing those things. The next step would be, when you're trying to build your followers and audience, is do a Blab with somebody, record it, and then try to do a quick little show. And finally, the other thing I learned too is, before you start doing podcasts, put it up on Blab and do several episodes like we've done with Meet the Voter, and tweak them out and get really good before you go up in the podcast and on iTunes, because that's where you want to really do well. You can also put them up on YouTube and test them there, and you'll see your numbers in YouTube. So where you start. So my message today would be, where do you start? Well, keep your job and do a side hustle. And I would say start by learning WordPress and the platform, and then set up some affiliate accounts. The problem is Amazon's not going to let you set up until you establish your site, until you have a decent looking WordPress site. So that said, with content, you can set up a WordPress site and just start dropping your blabs into that WordPress site. And that can be like your daily post. Type a few little sentences under it, and that's your blog. It's a great way to start. So that's where I think you should start. And if anybody's out there and wants to input or come up online and bring some ideas, that'd be great. Here's a point. It's really good to put your websites up. Thanks, Mike, for coming on as you're waiting. Hey, Mike.
Hello.
We're recording right now.
Okay.
What I'm doing is I'm putting up many of my websites. So I'm going to take us off recording for a second, and we'll talk a bit.
All right.
Is it Mike or Michael?
I go by Michael.
Coming from outside Atlanta, Georgia. And he's an investor in property, not in real estate, but an investment property, which I used to do, which I still think is one of the best things to do. But you have to have income and flow to do that. It's a hard to run a business by itself. So two things, Mike, how do you think you might be able to make some money online?
I think this would be a great medium for getting to know investors and letting investors, potential investors, get to know me and about our program and our properties here in Metro Atlanta. It's certainly a much more interactive approach than to me talking on the telephone or email or even a website. You can only do so much with text and pictures.
Right. It's a really good way to do an audio blog. Just take it and blog it every day. Maybe talk about a couple properties. What's your hottest property right now?
Wow. Right now, the best one we have is actually a 5-bedroom, 2-bath house in Southwest Atlanta. It's currently vacant, but we've had it tenanted in the past, and it's a great 5-bedroom houses are a little hard to come by inside the city limits, and it makes a great Section 8 rental for people that aren't opposed to Section 8. They tend to pay the best, and they always direct deposit on the 3rd of the month, and the checks never bounce.
I got a little Section 8 story. I was stationed overseas in Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009, and I was had a team, and I was on active duty. Had
Right.
a one of my technicians who worked for me was a really nice kid who's a reservist who got out and was just being a contractor, and he provided us our technical service. But his whole formula was he's staying in Afghanistan making about $200,000 a year. And he was single, 32. He's still a reservist.
Mm-hmm.
And when he had 20 houses, 20 units at the time, and he was building units. And he was in Baltimore, and he had 12 Section 8 brick homes. He said they couldn't hurt him. And he had a great positive cash flow. So he had about 6,000 positive cash flow there with those 12. And he was buying homes in Florida at the time because they're so darn cheap. And he started buying them in 2 locations. But he said when he had a $10,000 positive cash flow and $250,000 in the bank, he'd be done. And that he would live on that.
Sounds like a good plan.
That was his plan. And he was close. He was getting close. He's at 6 and probably had 100,000. But he wasn't making, believe it or not, 200,000 isn't a huge amount of money as a contractor. He was doing networking, running some of our computer systems.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a huge way to make money. But, we get rocketed from time to time. So it's not all, and you're remote. It's not the most comfortable place to be. But he'd always go home on his leave about every 6 months and buy another 1 or 2 units.
Yeah, it sounds like a great plan. If he was buying in Florida at that time period, it goes back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago was, that was really, if you had the intestinal fortitude to step up and make those purchases then in the midst of the market uncertainty and turmoil. I mean, was it still going to keep crashing? That was a big question. A lot of folks couldn't get excited about pulling the trigger because they assumed the worst,
Yeah.
And of course you had to have, you weren't going to the bank to borrow the money to buy. So you had to have access to the money somewhere, somehow. But if you could step up to the plate, like I said, the regret that I have today is that simply didn't buy more of what we saw available.
And you couldn't borrow against your own home to borrow more. That old formula in the old days is you bought a house, you borrowed against it, you bought another house. That's a dangerous formula in retrospect. Yeah,
that and, in 2008, you just simply couldn't borrow money for real estate. The banks were all but shut down.
Hopefully you had a positive cash flow in what you did have, because if you didn't, you couldn't rely on appreciation to make money. Out west in California, appreciation made most of the money for folks, and we had such a large appreciation, but then it was a two-edged sword, of course. I thought I was in pretty good shape. There's some things I could have done even better, but I went back on active duty in 2007 and consolidated. I was a design build contractor. Well, I think I might come up every day around 12 and just ask, hey, what are ways you can make money online or offline? And what we asked you to do is how you could apply this platform to make money online. But I think you're going the right way. Hey, I want to close with one thing, what not to do. And since I come from the real estate industry, I think this is good advice. Mm-hmm. I had friends who at the courthouse steps, they basically got in trouble because they fixed pricing and formed groups just exactly like you explained. Mm-hmm. And one in particular got in trouble. So explain what not to do, that little process of the investors getting together at the courthouse steps and deciding between themselves not to vote, and then to have a auction after the auction, because that's exactly the same situation that occurred out here in California. I'm in Nevada, but I was in California. The other thing too is the little concept too about maybe if you're a separate LLC, that's okay. If you pull everybody aside, form an LLC, then go and invest. That's one thing, but not doing it among yourselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, the group here in Metro Atlanta there were, like I said, there's, I think, almost 60 people now that have been sentenced or found guilty and are facing some adverse consequences. And what they were doing is they basically did agree amongst themselves that they wouldn't compete on these properties. And the problem comes in, a lot of these mortgages are federally insured. And if they're not directly federally insured, they are owned by a federally protected bank, because all banks are part of the FDIC system. And that's how the charges became federal in the case here in Metro Atlanta, because if the parties agreed to not compete with one another and bid up to $60,000 on the courthouse steps and then have a private auction amongst themselves, the federal argument against that was, hey, these folks are not bidding on the steps at that higher number that they subsequently pay. And that difference is coming out of the bank's pocket that was foreclosing on the property. And that's really where the rub was. And I think if they had simply created a entity, and they could have called it, hey, foreclosure bidding group number 1, or, Metro Atlanta Bidding Group LLC, and they all decide to participate in it, that's a different thing, because then they would, the entity would be buying the property and at whatever price it was, and they would all share equally. There wasn't some subsequent follow-on auction where additional money changed hands. I think that what reality is, at that moment in time, it worked. I don't think it's likely to happen anytime soon because of cases like you mentioned in California and the one here. I just don't see it happening. And you've got in Metro Atlanta today, there's a lot of investors are chasing the properties, and they're willing to run the prices on up anyway. So,
yep.
There's really not an opportunity to buy them at the sale without competition, and then rebid them for an additional larger amount later because somebody else is willing to pay it already.
Right. So I'm going to finish up this recording. Stay on the line because we can talk for a few minutes. I want to talk to you about apartments, some ideas, but great ideas. I'm going to try to come up every day at 12, so you'll be able to find me. I was up a little late today. I guess that would be 3 o'clock your time. You're Eastern, right?
That's right.
Yeah, my son was born in Dothan, Alabama. So right there, we flip over in Georgia, and I've spent a lot of time down in the South. When I got out of West Point, my first, 8 years of my life, except for Korea, were in the South, or 9. Oh no, I went to Fort Devens for 2 years. I forgot about that. 6 years.
Yeah, you would, if you went down through Dothan today, you'd probably be shocked. It has grown.
Oh, there's nothing there when my son was born. He's 29 now.
Yeah. And a lot of the growth though is interestingly enough probably within the last 15 years or so.
Well, Enterprise and Ozark, I'm sure, because of the military buildup in Rucker with aviation, being the home of aviation, that's a great place to invest. Probably a great place. Small apartments, things of that nature. Yeah, a really good idea.
I haven't done much investing on that side of the border. Columbus is a good market. It has been. But that whole corridor down through there has seen a fair amount of Eufaula down to Dothan has seen a fair amount of progress over the last 10 years and even 5 years, which has been surprising.
Yeah, I always like Florida too. Florida seemed like a great place to invest. Hey, well, I'm going to stay on. I'm going to cut the recording for today, and I'm going to put that up. Okay, thank you for tuning in to, I guess, the daily report from Bill. And I had fun doing this. Michael came up, was nice from Atlanta. It's nice to talk to somebody. We're just talking about ways, I'm just talking about ways to monetize or make money online and how much work it is. And maybe there's other ways too, tying it in. I think the best way is tying it in with something you already do and figuring out how to tweak it. Well, that said, until the next episode, hopefully it'll be up tomorrow at 12 o'clock Pacific. That's 3 o'clock Eastern and on a Blab.